And then I'm going to end with a couple recommendations. And these are just things that I'm thinking through. And really, I'm in a posture of learning as I live in this space of faith-based humanitarian response. So I really want to start with a story of that's been close to me of the last few years in the Syrian response. And I'm going to talk about a man, Pastor Jihad, who I think really exemplifies what a faith-inspired response to a crisis, a major humanitarian crisis, can look like. And Pastor Jihad is a pastor in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, not too far from the Syrian border. And but he has an interesting story because he grew up, and as a young man, he was angry, he would say himself, because he felt as the occupiers from Syria came in, he felt that a lot of tension with his Syrian occupiers. And so he saw them as enemies, and he did not like the Syrians. He just says that out plain and simple. I did not like my Syrian brothers. But over time, he would say God got a hold of his heart and gave him a heart of mercy and a heart of forgiveness. And then somehow in that call, God called him into ministry, and he became a pastor. And as he was a pastor, suddenly the Syrian crisis kicked in, and Pastor Jihad found himself suddenly face to face with what were formerly his Syrian enemies, now coming in as refugees into the community where he lived and into his church community, or into the community where his church was. And he was really conflicted. What do I do? But it was clear to him that his call was to be a man of mercy and to show the hand of compassion. And so he and his congregation, he inspired the congregation in their local community, said, we need to be a place of refuge. And over the past 4 years, he and his church community have become an incredible example of what it looked like to care for those who are oppressed. And in partnership with their Muslim brothers and sisters, they are reaching out and serving hundreds of Syrian children and keeping them educated. And thousands of families are being served food and helped getting other necessary resources into their hands. And now, as Pastor Jihad would say, my former enemies are now my friends. And I asked Pastor Jihad, I said, why are you doing this? Or what motivated you to do this? And I loved his statement. He said, because we have gone through the same thing. We have had wars with Syria, and we have had our own civil wars. And because this is our faith, this is what Christians do. So obviously, I'm going to be speaking now from a Christian perspective, but I think as all of us of faith would know, our faith can inspire us to do amazing things, and I think Pastor Jihad is an example of that. So as I think about the ministry and the work that Pastor Jihad is doing in partnership with other organizations in the Bekaa Valley, I was trying to think, what are the characteristics of a faith-based humanitarian response? So I've come up with 6 thoughts that I would say might be characteristics of a faith-based humanitarian response. One is, I think in the faith community, we understand the sacredness of life. Faith inherently understands the sacredness and dignity and transcendence of each person. So, a rights-based approach sometimes to me within the industry seems like a baseline. It's focused on the lowest common denominator of certain rights to asylum, food, shelter, and water. But when we understand people are created in the image of God, with a transcendence and a sacredness, then we can engage with the other person with greater honor. And instead of thinking of rights in terms of minimum standards of asylum, food, or education, we can think of rights in terms of abundance and community, and how we can help the other achieve their full God-given potential. And to me, I like the way that changes maybe the thinking about rights a little bit within our space, the humanitarian space. So, the first one, the sacredness of life. A second characteristic of the faith humanitarian community might be presence. Faith brings to bear one of the strongest and most sustainable local and global networks. Think churches, mosques, temples, and other houses of worship all over the world. Wherever you go, you see places of worship. That's a powerful presence. So with that presence, that global presence, comes global faith assets, as I've heard some call it, People, networks, leaders, infrastructures, buildings, all of these things, all of these resources become critical in emergencies. These assets can be mobilized immediately anywhere in the world. It takes those of us in the professional industry at the very fastest, 24, 36, usually 72 hours to get on the ground, even if I get on a plane like that. And when I get on a plane, what can I do? I'm one person. But the local faith community, the local mosque, the local temple, the local church, and their communities can respond immediately to those in need. So presence is everywhere, the presence. The other one thing, I like a quote from a pastor in Honduras. He said, we, the church, were here before the disaster, we were here during the disaster, and we are here after the disaster, and we, the church, will be here when you all leave. And I think that's true of all the faith communities that we represent in this room. A third is conscience. I think we in the faith communities really should or do have our finger on the pulse of need in the communities that we engage in globally. And so as a voice of conscience to the international humanitarian response, we can make sure that the most vulnerable are cared for and that their voice is heard. And so I think we need to be speaking into the United Nations and into the international systems to make sure those people that we know are in greatest need are served. I think a fourth characteristic is hope. Faith has a redemptive narrative of hope in the midst of suffering. Because of the sacredness and transcendence of life, suffering can be redeemed, and the faithful, at least as I understand the Christian tradition, believe God suffers with us and will one day redeem the earth's groanings and the groanings of those who suffer. So, and I've been in many emergencies and disasters around the world over the past 15 years, and I've seen just how critical hope is. And we've also heard, as we've talked with others here already, the importance of hope, even when you were talking about psychosocial care, how critical that is for trauma. A fifth characteristic is mercy. And faith brings a theology of forgiveness and mercy which can stop cycles of violence that we see all over the world. This coming year was declared by Pope Francis to be a jubilee of mercy, a year of mercy. And I like that. I'm looking forward to unpacking what that looks like for me personally and even for the broader faith community as we think about mercy in this time where there's so much of the opposite, so much revenge, so much of tit for tat, if that's a phrase that makes sense. So in a world of complex and violent wars, we need merciful peacemakers and humanitarian responders, people who can bear witness to a merciful God. And I would say people like Pastor Jihad, who was tempted as an angry young man to respond out of anger to his Syrian brothers, and now has become friends with them and finds himself living in community with them and serving alongside of them, and now he calls them friends. But that's because of mercy, which stopped the cycle for him of violence. And sixth and finally, a characteristic I would say is charity or giving. Charity can be used broadly, but faith brings values-based sustainable giving, not tax-based forced giving. And I like that. I like to write a check to an organization or to a person who I think is doing incredible work in a place like Syria or a place like Afghanistan. I don't like writing a check to the U.S. government, but I have to do both. Well, I have to do the second. I don't have to do the first, but I'm inspired to do the first. And I'd like to think it's because of my faith. And also, I think our faith can inspire our actions and not just giving financially, but of our time. And I think we all know, we've just heard about volunteers, Women for Women in Afghanistan, who are giving of their time. And you can bet that those women who are giving voluntarily are often giving with greater heart than if you're getting a paycheck and you're on a 3-month contract. The work, how hard we work when we're giving generously, it can really be powerful, and I would say transformative. So now on to the challenges. I think Sharon already expressed them pretty clearly, and I'm going to narrow them down to this. I think 2 of the ones she did as well. The challenges we in the faith-based community face is, 1, the perception of proselytization or proselytizing. And not only, sometimes it's not just a perception, sometimes it happens. And as Sharon made very clear, it cannot, should not ever happen in a time of emergency where people are under that kind of vulnerability. So I think we within the industry, within the faith community, need to really learn and embrace things like the Red Cross Code of Conduct and others. I'll talk about that later. Secondly, or the second challenge is lack of coordination. She already mentioned this. She called it segmentation, and so thus a loss of collective impact. So I'm going to close now with just recommendations, maybe ways we can counter these two challenges by building on some of our strengths that we already talked about, these characteristics. And I'm going to mention the characteristics one more time just so they're in your mind. Sacredness of life, presence, conscience, hope, mercy, and charity. So as we confront the challenges of proselytization and the challenges of segmentation or lack of coordination, I think two things come to mind. The first is engaging and speaking the language of the international community. There is something called the Red Cross Code of Conduct, and most of the international faith-based organizations engage on that. And that basically says aid is given regardless of race, creed, or nationality, and without distinctions of any kind. It's based on need. And then secondly, aid will not be used to further any political or religious standpoint. And that's critical in our work wherever we engage around the world. But I think there's actually even a higher call, and it comes from our faith itself. And I think all of our faiths share this, but I like what, and I'm not Catholic, but I like what Pope Benedict said in his encyclical, God is Love. He wrote beautifully, charity, furthermore, cannot be used as a means of engaging in what is nowadays considered proselytism. Love is free. It is practiced as a way, it is not practiced as a way of achieving other ends. Those who practice charity in the church's name will never seek to impose the church's faith upon others. They realize that a pure and generous love is the best witness to the God in whom we believe and by whom we are driven to love. And I think that is something shared by all of our faith traditions, that charity is free, love is free. And in the humanitarian context, it should just overflow. And hopefully that can help counter some of the ways we are perceived in the faith community and also the way we engage in our work. And then finally, I'm going to close with the second recommendation, which is something that has inspired me for a long time. It's from the Old Testament prophet Micah, and some of you may have heard this scripture before from the sacred text. He writes, God has shown you what is good and what the Lord requires of you, to act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I'll say it again, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And I would say these are three pillars of how humanitarian response can be engaged in from a faith perspective. And it actually distinguishes us from our friends, and I call them friends at the United Nations or some of our more secular organizations. And the reason I say it distinguishes us is the first one we share, to do justice, to spread that as we do our work, to love mercy, to care for people with great mercy wherever we are engaging. But that third one, I think, is critically important for people of faith, to walk humbly with God. Because what it does is it aligns us. As I engage around the world, often I'm engaging in places where Islam is the preeminent religion. And I find great common ground because we share this humble obedience to a higher power, to God. And so I think as we walk in humility with God and subsequently with others, it actually can transform our humanitarian response from a material rights-based activity of physical aid to a sacred act of faith that is worthy of the dignity and the transcendence of those we are called to walk with in their suffering. And that's really what I hope I do personally, our organization does, and even all of us as we engage from our various faith perspectives. So, thank you.